Orchestration often consists of more than one plane of tone. There's usually some kind of main line in the foreground, and then there are the background planes. The bass line is obviously important when there's full harmony. But apart from the simplest chorale-style realizations, where the middle parts just fill out the chords, more interesting orchestral background usually consists of resonance and or movement. In our last lesson, we looked at orchestral resonance. Now let's take a deeper look at orchestral movement with various examples from the repertoire. But first, think of all the films you've seen where the music reflects the action and the story. Without it, the visual world alone would be much less effective. Movement of the kind I'm talking about here begins to appear in the classical period. Bach's orchestration was mainly contrapuntal. The secondary lines were melodically interesting, usually real counterpoints. The basso continuo served to unite the harmony of the various contrapuntal strands. But with the classical orchestra of Haydn and Mozart, the continuo disappears, and, as we saw in the previous lesson, the orchestra starts to need some secondary parts to create resonance. In the same way, we start seeing background figuration that is not contrapuntal, but whose function is to give a sense that the texture is alive, not just static. This is what I mean by orchestral movement. Indeed, if we think about it, music itself is movement and sound. The movement is often not secondary, but rather fundamental to the effect on the listener. Here's an example from Mozart's Symphony No. 41 in the last movement. The first 4 bars are the music as written by Mozart. The other 4 bars are harmonic reduction. The harmony and orchestration are the same, but the overall effect is quite different. Those oscillating eighth notes create an energy that's a big part of the music's character. Another example from the same piece. As before, the arpeggio figuration in the second violin fills out the harmony, but also adds movement and life to the texture. The second 4 bars are exactly the same music, but without it. Again, the added movement makes the character so much more alive. This example has another aspect that the first one does not. In addition to the main line in violin 1, the woodwinds add bits of counterpoint, making the texture even richer, giving it a sense of dialogue. Again, the version without it seems impoverished. Now another example from Beethoven, the beginning of the Ninth Symphony. The first 4 bars are as written, and the following version simply removes the movement, in this case the tremolos. The version without the tremolos is calm and quiet. The version with the tremolos has a completely different character. Now it's become a kind of nervous anticipation. Now a little example from Mahler's Symphony No. 4, the beginning of the second movement. The horn has the main line here. Then, when the open little phrase is repeated in the 3rd and 4th bars, Mahler has those repeated notes and trills in the woodwind. The second version has those notes as harmony, but just sustained. As we can see, a great deal of the nervous energy comes from the movement in the woodwind. Our next example is from the beginning of Wagner's Das Rheingold. This example, from the start of the ring cycle, is very famous, so it goes on for a very long time, just moving around one single E-flat major chord. This beginning represents the water in the depths of the Rhine, as 3 Rhine maidens swim around guarding the Rhinegold. I've only played the first 3 minutes here. Actually, this passage goes on much longer, still over the same chord. After introducing the open fifth in the first system, 2 of the horns start rising arpeggios in the second system. Then in the third system, these arpeggios are presented in imitation in all 8 horns. Then at the end of page 2, the strings add 8th note arpeggios gradually rising up and down, which also introduce some passing notes for the first time. Then on page 6, the arpeggios speed up to 16th notes. Note how the clarinets now start incorporating 16th notes into the passing note motive. Following this, the texture becomes even fuller until the voices come in for the first time and the harmony finally changes. Since the harmony in introduction here is totally static, what keeps the music interesting for the listener? The answer is the gradual progressions of texture, register, and rhythm above the E-flat major chord. Here the movement itself is actually the foreground, and the emotional effect is very powerful. The waves suggest water, and the progressions make the music more and more intense as we prepare for the start of the narrative. Now let's look at the beginning of the second movement of Debussy's La Mer, Jeu de Vagues. This is about waves of water in the ocean. In this passage, there's no melody to speak of, just the waves and the texture. Each wave starts with a quiet tremolo in the strings, first viola, then second violin, then first violin. These entries first rise and then descend. The woodwind chords sustain the harmony, but the durations are not the same. As the strings start to descend, the higher woodwinds disappear. In the second phrase, Debussy adds 2 flutes sustained, enriching the higher register. Also note how Debussy marks the peak with the glockenspiel motive, and then enriches the descent with the harp figure and the cymbal. While the overall feeling is rise and fall, the details are not 100% consistent. For example, the harp rises up again at the end of its arpeggio, and the cello and basses mark the second beat pizzicato rather than the first. In other words, the texture has several layers. It's not simply one rise and fall. This is like nature. Progressions in nature are rarely one-dimensional and linear. From the listener's point of view, the gesture is much richer. Here's another example from La Mer. It starts in the middle of the first page with the D-flat major key signature. This example is even more rich and complex. First we hear the second violins and half the violas, arco, doing trills and tremolos. Then cellos arrive, also divisi. The top celli have a motive circling around D-flat or E-flat. The bottom half of the cello section has a more melodic figure that repeats. The lower half of the violas consists of repeated notes, pizzicato, adding a gentle pulsation. The bassoons provide a bit of resonance underneath. The harps also add touches of movement. Then in the next 2 bars, the string configuration stays the same, but the harp plays a line using notes from the upper strings, creating a sort of zigzag line between them. The flutes and clarinets play parallel fifths and octaves. This is the foreground for these 2 bars. In the next bar, the second harp creates a descending line using the same notes as the clarinet, but with octave doublings. Finally, in the last 2 bars of our example, the horns have the main line, and the strings go on as before. The harps again do a kind of zigzag heterophony with the strings, which gives them a new motive. The movement here is multi-layered. Each layer has its own motive, which may or may not change as the foreground changes. There are other examples in La Mer of such multi-layered texture. The students could learn a lot by going through the score and analyzing the textures in this way. Finally, one of the greatest examples of orchestral music ever composed, the beginning of Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe, Suite No. 2. Although the main line is actually in the low strings and the resonance is in the upper strings and horns, the movement here is in the woodwinds and the harps. Notice that while the harps play glissando scales, the woodwind parts contain a lot of non-harmonic tones, making their parts harmonically richer. In other words, Ravel wanted the movement to be more than just arpeggios, and it is this rich movement that gives us the feeling of daybreak, la levée du jour. As I mentioned before, movement in nature is never simple and totally predictable. It's clear that Ravel wanted to create a comparable richness here. Rather than just using formulaic arpeggios, these non-harmonic tones in the woodwind make the overall effect much more like nature itself. There are clearly perceptible waves, but the details aren't simple or totally predictable. This kind of concern with movement changes it at times from background to foreground. When it's rich enough and has a sense of overall progression, it can indeed become the main point of interest. But the figuration has to be motivically consistent. If the motives in any given layer change too much during the phrase, it will distract the listener from the main line. Orchestral figuration is an important reason for learning counterpoint. Although it's not semilimitation like a fugue, being able to make the little details interesting rather than just formulaic requires the kind of thinking that counterpoint teaches us. When looking at examples in the repertoire, look at the overall shape and progression of the movement, then at the details along the way. Also examine textures with more than one layer of movement. Which lines are the most prominent, which lines are less so? How is the orchestral balance controlled so that no one line takes over completely? This is, once again, a case where the things usually discussed in analysis courses, like harmony, don't really suffice to understand the music. Orchestral movement can be a very important part of the music's effect on the listener, and organizing it requires contrapuntal skills at times, as well as lots of attention to timbre, register, and progression.